She was 22 years old, sitting in a blizzard with $11 in a dead man's secret. Three riders appeared from the white. The largest one said nothing. He held out his hand. She had 1 second. She placed her hand in his. Neither of them knew yet what that single moment would cost them and what it would build. This is that story. The snow came sideways. It did not fall the way snow falls in paintings or in the gentle imaginings of people who have never been caught in a true winter storm. It came in hard and fast and mean, driven by a wind that had no patience for anything soft. It scoured the earth and swallowed the horizon and turned the world into a single white nothing that pressed in from every direction at once. Eleanor Hargrove sat with her back against a boulder that rose from the frozen ground like a broken tooth. She had been walking for nearly 2 hours. She had stopped because her legs had stopped, not because she had chosen to rest. Her feet had gone quiet inside her boots. That particular kind of quiet that comes just before pain becomes something more serious, and she recognized it the way a person recognizes a sound they have heard before in a bad dream. She did not cry. This surprised her in the small, rational part of her mind that was still running calculations, still observing herself from a slight distance. She had imagined somewhere in the blurred geography between Boston and this stone and this snow that if things went badly enough, she would cry. She had thought of herself as someone who could do that. But sitting here now with the wind eating through her traveling coat and her fingers curled hard around the strap of her bag, she found that whatever part of her made tears had simply gone somewhere else for a while. There was nothing left to spend on weeping. There was only the cold and the white and the sound of her own breathing. She was 22 years old. She had traveled more than 3,000 miles. She was sitting in a blizzard on the edge of the Arizona territory with $11.40 a change of clothes, a novel she had read 3 times already, and a small leather ledger that had belonged to a dead man she had never met. This was not the life she had planned. But then the life she had planned had not been particularly generous with its promises either. She pressed her back harder against the boulder and pulled her coat tighter and kept her eyes open, watching the white nothing for something that was not white nothing. And in that watching and that refusal to close her eyes and drift, there was something that was not quite courage and not quite stubbornness, but lived in the narrow territory between them. Something her father had called her best quality and her worst, depending on the day. She was still holding on. She had always been very good at holding on. The sound came through the wind like something imagined, like the mind playing the trick it plays on people who are alone and cold and beginning to run low on sensible options. 3 sets of hoofbeats, muffled and rhythmic, coming from somewhere ahead of her in the white. Eleanor did not close her eyes. She kept watching. And then, like shapes rising slowly from the surface of a dream, 3 riders appeared. She did not call out to them. She simply sat and watched them come. And when the nearest one pulled his horse up short and looked down at her with eyes the color of amber whiskey, she looked back at him without flinching. She had nothing left to be afraid of that she had not already been afraid of today. The man was enormous. She had seen tall men in Boston, men of consequence, and bearing men who filled a door frame and commanded a room. She had never seen a man who seemed to have been built by the land itself, assembled from the same materials as the rock she was leaning against, and the mountains that were somewhere behind the snow. He wore a heavy coat, dusted white, and a wide-brim hat with the brim pushed down against the wind. And when he swung down from his horse, he moved with the easy economy of someone who had never wasted emotion in his life. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he needs to measure before he decides how to handle it. Not cold, not warm, something in between, something careful and exact. "Where are you trying to get to?" he said. His voice was low and unhurried, a voice that did not raise itself for weather. "There is a settlement north of here," Eleanor said. She was proud of how steady her own voice came out. "I was told there is a church. I believe I lost the road in the storm." One of the other riders moved his horse up alongside the first. He was younger, with a face that was still working out what kind of face it wanted to be, and he was looking at her boots with an expression of genuine concern that he made no effort to conceal. The settlement north of here is 15 miles, this one said. Nobody walks 15 miles in this. The third rider had already dismounted without being asked. He was the youngest of the three, barely into his middle 20s by the look of him, and he was crouching down with the comfortable ease of someone who had spent a great deal of his life close to the ground, studying things up close. Your feet, he said. When did they go numb? Some time ago, Eleanor said. The first man, one who had spoken at first, looked at her for a long moment. He was taking inventory of her, she understood. Not of her in the way that Mr. Crenshaw had looked at her back in Red Rock, not with the assessing gaze of someone calculating what she was worth. He was reading her situation, measuring the gap between where she was and where she needed to be, and deciding with whatever arithmetic he used for such decisions what the right thing to do was. Triple H Ranch is 4 miles, he said finally. You will ride with me. The storm will not break before morning. He held out his hand. It was a working man's hand, broad across the palm and cross-hatched with old calluses and the small white lines of a dozen forgotten injuries. It was not the hand of a man who asked for things or waited for permission. It was simply extended, offered matter of fact. Eleanor looked at that hand for exactly 1 second. Then she placed her own hand in it. She did not know yet that this would be the most consequential decision she would make in her 22 years of living. She did not know that this single gesture, this cold hand meeting another in an Arizona Territory blizzard on the 4th day of December in the year of 1872, would one day be the story she told her grandchildren when they asked her how things had begun. She knew only that the hand was warm, and that she had not felt something warm in a very long time. His name was Caleb Hartwell. She would learn this later by the fire. The one with the concerned eyes was his brother Silas. The youngest was Gideon. And the ranch they were taking her to, the set of log buildings that materialized from the storm, like an answer to a prayer we had not known she was still capable of making, was called the Triple H. And it had been built by their father and their father's father, and then rebuilt again by Caleb himself, board by board. During the first year, he arrived with his wife and slept in a canvas tent while the timber dried. His wife. But that part came later. First came the beginning. And the beginning was this Eleanor Hargrove arriving in the Arizona Territory on the 4th day of December with $11.40 and a story that had gone wrong before it started. Let us go back 12 days to Boston to understand how she came to be leaning against a boulder in a blizzard with her feet going quiet and no one in the world who knew exactly where she was. Her father had died in September. Franklin Hargrove had been a careful man who kept careful records and worried carefully about the future, and had nevertheless been surprised by the particular future that arrived for him in the form of a weak heart in a cold autumn morning and a set of stairs that proved too steep for a man who had not slept well in 3 years. He left Eleanor the contents of a small desk, a collection of books she already knew by heart, and a lease on an apartment in the South End that was due for renewal in November at a rate she could not afford on her teacher's salary alone. She had known this. He had known this. They had spoken around it in the careful language of people who love each other and cannot find a way to fix the thing that needs fixing. After the funeral, after the books were boxed and the desk cleared, and the lawyer had confirmed with the practiced gentleness of a man who had delivered bad news many times that there was in fact nothing else, Eleanor had sat in the empty apartment and done what she had always done when the situation was serious. She had read the newspaper. The advertisement was in the personal column of the Boston Daily Advertiser, sandwiched between a notice for a lost terrier and an announcement for a lecture on the history of the Roman aqueduct. Respectable merchant, Arizona Territory, age 42, seeks honest and educated young woman as wife. Comfortable home guaranteed. References provided. Passage arranged. Inquiries welcome. She had written back the same evening. His name, he told her, was Owen Greer. His letters were precise and well-constructed, the letters of an educated man, and he had answered her questions about his circumstances with what seemed like openness and some degree of wit. He sent references. He sent a bank draft for the cost of her passage. He wrote in his last letter before she departed that he awaited her arrival with great anticipation and that the house was prepared. She had not been in love with him. She had been honest with herself about that. She had been in need of a solution, and Owen Greer had looked in the careful columns of a Boston newspaper, like a solution that came with a roof and a future, and a man who seemed at the very least decent. She had packed 2 trunks. She had said goodbye to the apartment and the street and the city that had been the whole geography of her life until then. She had boarded a series of trains that grew progressively less comfortable and progressively more magnificent in their emptiness. The land outside the windows changing from the dense green certainty of New England to something vaster and more indifferent and more honest than anything she had seen before. She arrived at the Red Rock station on the 4th of December, 12 days after leaving Boston, with her larger trunk in the luggage car and her smaller bag in her hand, and a letter in her coat pocket that she had read so many times the fold lines had gone soft. There was no one waiting. She stood on the platform for 45 minutes. She watched other passengers find their people and disappear into the life of the town. She watched a man load crates onto a wagon. She watched a dog investigate the base of the water tower with deep professional commitment. She did not allow herself to feel the thing that was gathering at the back of her throat, the thing that tasted like the recognition of a mistake that could not be unmade. Finally, she went to find the station master. He was a heavy-set man with a mustache that had been grown with more ambition than his face could fully support. He looked at her with a particular expression of someone who already knows what they are about to say and wishes they did not have to say it. He reached into the drawer of his cluttered desk without being asked and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. He set it on the counter between them. She read it standing there with her bag in her hand and the sound of the station going on around her in its ordinary way. Owen Greer, merchant, found deceased December 1st, 1872. Robbery and murder. Matter of his estate pending resolution. Creditors to contact the county office. 3 days before she arrived. He had been dead for 3 days before she set foot in Arizona. She stood very still for a moment that lasted much longer than a moment. Then she folded the notice and put it in her coat pocket next to the letter that had promised her a house and a future and a man who seemed at the very least decent. She thanked the station master. She walked outside into the cold afternoon and looked at the town of Red Rock, Arizona, which was smaller and dustier and less inclined toward promise than anything Owen Greer had led her to believe. And she went to find somewhere to sleep, because the problem of tonight had to be solved before the problem of everything else could even be properly examined. Mrs. Lucinda Hobson ran the only boarding house in Red Rock that was willing to take a woman traveling alone without a letter from a male relative or a local reference. She was a thin woman who wore her suspicion the way other women wore jewelry prominently, and with a certain pride in the quality of the piece. She charged $1 per night. She served breakfast between 6 and 7, no exceptions. She did not encourage conversation. Eleanor had enough money for 4 nights. She spent the first night lying awake in a narrow bed, listening to the wind work at the window and going over her options with the careful thoroughness she had inherited from her father. She was not a woman who allowed herself the luxury of panic for very long. Panic was not information. Panic was noise. What she needed was information. In the morning, she went to the county office and was told in careful official language that as a woman who had not yet legally married Owen Greer, she had no claim on his estate. There was no estate to speak of in any case. Owen Greer's shop was heavily mortgaged, and his house had already been claimed against outstanding debt. The man had, as the county clerk put it, with the precision of someone who has spent many years reading between the lines of documents, been living well beyond the reach of his actual resources. She returned to the boarding house and sat in her room and thought. The knock came that afternoon, sharp and businesslike, while the light outside the window was going orange with the early winter dusk. The man who entered when she opened the door was perhaps 50, with the careful grooming and the measured smile of someone whose profession required him to seem trustworthy rather than be it. He introduced himself as Arthur Crenshaw, attorney at law, representing the interests of Colonel Warren Briggs. She had not heard of Colonel Warren Briggs. She had not heard of him, but she understood him within approximately 3 minutes of Mr. Crenshaw's very polished explanation of her circumstances. Warren Briggs was a man who owned things in Red Rock. He owned the land under the building she was sleeping in. He owned the mortgage on Owen Greer's shop. He owned, if Mr. Crenshaw was to be believed, a substantial portion of the financial architecture of this small corner of the Arizona territory. And he was a man who believed in what he called the orderly resolution of obligations. Miss Hargrove, Mr. Crenshaw explained with the practiced regret of a man explaining that your winning lottery ticket had unfortunately been printed on paper that was not quite the right shade of blue, found herself in a situation of what he called contractual entanglement. There had been between Owen Greer and Colonel Briggs certain agreements regarding certain obligations. One of those obligations touched upon the matter of Miss Hargrove's passage and arrival. Colonel Briggs had, in the most generous spirit, already paid the costs associated with that passage. $180. It was not a large sum by the standards of a man of Colonel Briggs's resources, but it was, Mr. Crenshaw noted, a debt of obligation nonetheless. Colonel Briggs was a reasonable man. He wished only to offer Miss Hargrove a dignified solution to her circumstances. He operated a number of establishments in Red Rock and the surrounding territory. He had need of educated women of good character to serve in positions of management and hospitality at his principal business, the Silver Palace. Eleanor let Mr. Crenshaw finish his very well-organized speech. Then she said, "What is the Silver Palace?" Mr. Crenshaw smiled the smile of a man who had expected this question and had a prepared answer. "It is the principal entertainment establishment in Red Rock, Miss Hargrove, a saloon and gaming house of the highest order." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "I see," she said, "and the position Colonel Briggs is offering. Is it a bookkeeping position?" Mr. Crenshaw's smile did not waver. "Colonel Briggs values a woman who understands numbers," he said. "I imagine he does," Eleanor said. She stood up and walked to the door and opened it. "Thank you very much for your visit, Mr. Crenshaw. I think we have nothing further to discuss." After he left, she sat back down on the narrow bed and allowed herself precisely 10 minutes of the thing she had been holding back since she stood at the station master's counter and read the notice about Owen Greer. Not panic. She still would not give herself panic, but something honest and unglamorous and necessary, the way you drain a wound before it can fester. Then she opened the small leather ledger she had been given at the undertaker's office, along with the rest of Owen Greer's personal effects. She had glanced at it on the train. Now she read it with the full attention of someone who understands that understanding is at this particular moment the only resource she has left. She did not understand all of it. Owen Greer had written in a combination of straightforward accounting and abbreviations that served as a private code, the system of a man who kept records not for posterity, but for himself alone. But she was an educated woman who had spent 2 years teaching arithmetic to the children of Boston, and numbers had their own logic that ran beneath the surface of whatever language dressed them in. What she could read was this: Owen Greer had borrowed money from many people, including a ranch operation referred to consistently as Triple H, and a set of brothers whose surname was Hartwell. He had repaid some of these debts partially and others not at all. There were payments coming in from Colonel Briggs, labeled with a notation she could not immediately decode, and at the very bottom of the last page, written in a hand that was slightly different from the neat accounting above it, as though written quickly or in a different state of mind, there was a short notation. She read it 3 times. She sat for a long time with the ledger in her hands. Then she put it in her bag next to the novel and the dead man's letter, and laid down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and began making plans for the morning. Because the thing she had read, if she was reading it correctly, meant that she had not come here as a woman seeking a husband. She had come here as an arrangement, as a piece of a transaction between 2 men, neither of whom had thought it necessary to inform her that she was being traded. MOB arrangement. EOH arrives December 4th. Collateral secured. MOB, mail order bride. EOH, Eleanor O. Hargrove. Owen Greer had placed the advertisement. Owen Greer had selected her from among the women who answered. Owen Greer had paid her passage and written his careful letters and assured her of a comfortable home. And Owen Greer had been paid for all of it by Warren Briggs, because Warren Briggs wanted what Warren Briggs always wanted, which was something he could use. She thought about the Silver Palace. She thought about Mr. Crenshaw's carefully maintained smile. She thought about what exactly a well-educated woman of good character was expected to manage and provide hospitality for in a saloon and gaming house in the Arizona Territory in the year 1872. Then she put the ledger away and did not take it out again that night. In the morning before the sky had fully made up its mind about whether to be light or dark, she packed everything she could carry, left the larger trunk where it stood because it was too heavy, and she was going to need to move fast, and walked out of Mrs. Hobson's boarding house before the breakfast hour. She had made one inquiry the previous afternoon before Mr. Crenshaw arrived. There was a settlement north of Red Rock, perhaps 20 miles by the road, where a small congregation of homesteading families had built a church and a community hall. The minister there was said to be a good man. She had no particular connection to religion, but a minister in a frontier settlement was usually connected to every network of help and shelter and honest human obligation that existed in the surrounding territory. It was a better option than anything Red Rock had offered her. She walked north on the road out of town. She had been walking for 45 minutes when she became aware that the sky to the north had gone from gray to something darker and more purposeful. She had been walking for an hour and 15 minutes when the snow started. She had been walking for 2 hours when the storm became something else entirely, and she could no longer see the road under her feet or the trees that she knew were somewhere to her left or anything at all, except the white that pressed in from all directions. She found the boulder and sat down against it, and eventually the riders came. The Triple H Ranch was built into a shallow valley between two long ridges that broke the worst of the northern wind. Coming down into it through the storm, Caleb riding ahead with Eleanor behind him and her hands at his back for balance, she had a sense of shelter before she could see the buildings clearly, a change in the air, a place where the wind's argument with the world became slightly less insistent. Then the buildings resolved from the white, a main house of squared logs with a stone chimney trailing smoke, a longer outbuilding connected by a covered walkway, a barn beyond that and a chicken coop and a fence line running off into the storm. It was not large by the standards she had known in Boston, but it was solid. It was the kind of solid that is not built in a season or declared with a deed. It was the kind of solid that accumulates one winter at a time, one repaired board at a time, one season of endurance laid carefully on top of the last. An older man emerged from the barn as they rode in. He was perhaps 60, with a face like weathered saddle leather and eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that have seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by most of it. He looked at Eleanor, sitting behind Caleb on the horse with snow in her hair and her traveling coat dark with wet. He looked at Caleb. Then he simply nodded once and began leading the horses toward the barn without a word spoken in either direction. His name was Walt Calloway. She would learn this later. She would learn that Walt had worked the Triple H for 20 years, since before it had a proper name, since before the main house had a second room. She would learn that he had a habit of making his assessments of people in the first 45 seconds of meeting them and rarely revising those assessments afterward. She would learn much later that the single nod he gave her in the snow that evening was, by the standards of Walt Calloway, an enthusiastic welcome. Inside the main house, the fire in the stone hearth had been built up while they were gone, and the warmth was so sudden and so complete after the cold outside that Eleanor had to stand still for a moment and simply breathe it in. The room was large by frontier standards, with a rough-hewn table that could seat 6 a row of shelves carrying books and tools in roughly equal proportion, and a cast-iron stove in the corner that threw heat with the dedicated efficiency of something that has been doing its job for many years and knows how to do it right. Gideon Hartwell had her boots off before she had quite registered that he was kneeling at her feet. He was doing it with the brisk practicality of someone addressing a problem that needs addressing, not with ceremony. He examined her feet, pressed carefully at specific points, announced that she would be fine, and went to find dry socks with the same decisive energy he seemed to apply to everything. Silas Hartwell had disappeared into the kitchen and was making noise with pots. The smell of wood smoke and coffee and something savory coming from the stove was almost more than Eleanor could manage with any kind of composure after 12 days of train food and 3 days of boarding house meals served in silence. Caleb Hartwell had hung his coat on the peg by the door and was standing at the window looking out at the storm, not talking to anyone, not explaining himself, or making himself comfortable in the performance of hospitality. He was simply present in the quiet way of someone who does not need to fill silence to feel at ease in it. On the mantel above the fireplace, there was a single photograph in a simple wooden frame. A young woman, dark-haired, light-eyed, with a smile that seemed to be only partly for the camera and mostly for someone standing just outside the frame. No one mentioned the photograph. Eleanor looked at it for no more than a moment and then looked away because some things in a room tell you what not to ask about before you have any other information. They ate at the big table. Silas had made bean stew with salt pork and cornbread baked in the cast iron skillet, simple food made by someone who knew what simple food needed to be, which was hot and plentiful and real. Gideon talked during the meal, something about a fence section on the eastern edge of the property that had been giving trouble and the particular stubbornness of one specific fence post that he seemed to regard as a personal adversary. The story required no particular contribution from anyone else and served the purpose of filling the air with something human and unhurried. Silas ate and asked Eleanor with the careful directness of someone who is genuinely curious and not merely polite what part of Boston she was from and whether she had family still there. She answered as honestly as the questions required, which meant briefly. He received her brief answers without pressing. Caleb ate. He cleared his plate before anyone else was finished. He poured himself a second cup of coffee and moved to the chair nearest the fire, and after a moment, he picked up a book from the side table, a real book, cloth bound and worn at the spine, and opened it. Eleanor noticed this. She filed it away in the part of her mind that was always, even in difficult circumstances, cataloging the world she found herself in. After the meal, when Gideon had taken the dishwater out, and Silas was doing the washing up with the methodical contentment of someone who does not mind this particular domestic labor, Eleanor approached Caleb Hartwell at his chair by the fire. "I need to tell you the truth about why I am here," she said. "And I need to ask whether there is any work I can do in exchange for shelter until the weather clears." He closed his book. He did not invite her to sit. He waited. She told him everything. She told it the way she had been telling herself things all her life, which was without ornament and without self-pity, because neither of those things had ever made a situation better. She told him about Owen Greer in the advertisement, in the letters, in the passage. She told him about arriving to find a death notice instead of a husband. She told him about Mr. Crenshaw and Colonel Briggs and the Silver Palace and the position of management and hospitality that was not a bookkeeping position. She did not yet tell him about the ledger. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The fire made its small sounds between them. "Owen Greer owed this ranch $800, he said. Borrowed it 6 months ago to expand his store. Said he would repay within the quarter." Eleanor met his eyes. "I did not know that." "I know you did not," he said. There was no accusation in it. "He is dead. I do not collect from the dead, and I do not collect from people who owe me nothing." He was quiet again. Then, the room at the end of the connecting hall. It was the ranch hands' quarters when we had more men on. It is clean and it is warm. You can stay until the storm passes and the road north is passable. He picked up his book. "Until the road clears," Eleanor said. "Until then," he agreed without looking up from the page. She thanked him. She meant it precisely and without decoration, the way she meant things that mattered. Then she went to find her room and she lay down on the narrow bunk with her coat over the blanket, and she listened to the storm push at the logs of the Triple H ranch, and she did not sleep for a long time. She was thinking about the ledger. She was thinking about what it meant that Owen Greer had somewhere in the columns of his careful private accounting a notation that connected her name and the date of her arrival to the name of a man who owned a saloon and believed that a debt could be made of a person. She was thinking about the fact that she was lying in a room that belonged to a stranger in a ranch she had been carried to by accident and weather with $11.40 and no plan beyond the next morning. And somewhere beneath all of this thinking, beneath all of this careful inventory of what she did and did not have, there was something else, something quieter. The memory of a hand extended in the snow, the warmth of it, the way it had not asked her anything, it simply offered. She kept thinking about that hand. She told herself it was only because she had been cold. She almost believed it. 16 days passed before the first blow came from outside. 16 days during which Eleanor Hargrove learned that she could in fact chop wood with reasonable competence after the third attempt. That the particular language between a man and his horse was a language worth learning if you had access to a patient teacher. That Silas Hartwell built furniture the way some men wrote music with attention to things that did not strictly need attending to. That Gideon Hartwell could be trusted with any practical problem and with almost no theoretical ones. And that Walt Calloway had in his many years of watching people developed a capacity for silence that was not emptiness, but its own form of conversation. She learned that Caleb read in the evenings, always by the fire, always seriously. She learned that he was awake before anyone else, and that he moved through the pre-dawn dark of the ranch with a self-sufficiency so complete it was almost like watching a natural phenomenon. She learned that when he spoke, which was not often, there was not a word in it that had not been considered. One afternoon near the end of the second week, she was reading near the window when he came in from the cold and poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. She was reading her copy of Middlemarch, which she had read 3 times before, and was reading again because some books give you different things at different ages and in different circumstances. "Is it interesting?" he said. It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a man who had been thinking about whether to speak and had decided after some consideration that he would. "George Eliot," she said. "Have you read it? My father had it. He thought men should read novels to understand women." She looked at him. He was looking at the window, at the snow still falling beyond the glass. "Novels do not explain women," she said. "They explain people." He turned from the window and looked at her directly. It lasted only a moment before he turned back to his coffee. But there was something in that moment, a quality of attention that was different from the measured assessment of the past 2 weeks. "That makes sense," he said. It was not much, but from Caleb Hartwell, who did not waste words, it was its own kind of statement. On the 16th day, a rider came in from Red Rock. Eleanor watched from the window as Gideon went out to meet the man, a spare figure on a dark horse, impeccably dressed in a way that was wrong for the weather and wrong for the territory and perfectly calibrated for the impression it was meant to make. She recognized him by his posture before she could see his face. "Mr. Crenshaw," he handed Gideon an envelope and spoke briefly and rode back the way he had come without being invited inside. Caleb read the letter at the table, standing with the same expression he wore when reading fence line reports and weather assessments. He read it twice. Then he set it down. Eleanor came and stood at the other side of the table. It was a formal legal notice produced on good paper with the letterhead of a Tucson law firm and bearing the signatures of Colonel Warren Briggs and a county judge whose name Eleanor did not recognize. It stated in the organized language of men who use language as a structure for making unfair things look orderly that Eleanor O. Hargrove was in violation of a contractual obligation to Colonel Briggs in the amount of $180 representing costs of passage and accommodation. The notice allowed 30 days for resolution. Resolution meant either the repayment of the full amount or alternatively the commencement of service at Colonel Briggs's establishment in a capacity to be determined. At the bottom of the notice, in a separate paragraph, almost casual in its placement, Colonel Briggs expressed his continued interest in resolving certain outstanding matters of land use adjacent to the Triple H property and looked forward to further discussion come spring. Caleb looked at Eleanor. "Did you know about this?" "I knew he wanted me to work for him," she said. "I did not know he had a document." She looked at the envelope still in Caleb's hand. Then she made a decision. She went to her room and came back with the leather ledger. She placed it on the table between them. She explained what it was and where it had come from. She showed him the pages explaining what she'd been able to read and what remained opaque to her. She showed him the final notation, the 3 lines in the different hand, the lines she had read in Mrs. Hobson's boarding house, and then lain awake thinking about through a long, cold night. Caleb read. Then Silas read over his brother's shoulder, his face doing the thing it did when he was processing something serious, which was to become very still and very attentive. Gideon read the last section and then read it again and then set the ledger down on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone controlling a response that wants to be less careful. The fire spoke in the silence. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the stillness it left behind was its own kind of weight. Silas looked at the ledger and then at Caleb. She had nothing to do with any of this. I know, Caleb said. Eleanor was watching Caleb Hartwell. She was watching the way he absorbed what he had read without the performance of outrage, without the noise that lesser men would have made. She was watching the way he took it in and turned it over and set it in its proper place in a map of the situation that was clearly updating itself in real time. He looked up from the ledger and met her eyes. You do not owe Briggs anything, he said. That notice has no legal standing. The contract it claims you violated was not a contract you were party to. You did not sign it, and you were not informed of it. I understand that, she said, but understanding it and being able to act on it are not the same thing. No, Caleb agreed, they are not. He stood up from the table. He went to the window. The storm had passed, and the world outside was white and still and very cold under a sky that was finally clearing toward blue. She waited. He turned from the window. Briggs moves when he thinks there is no one to push back, he said. He has been doing this in this territory for 3 years, and he has gotten better at it each time because no one has made it cost him anything. He looked at her steadily with eyes that were neither promising her anything nor pulling away from the weight of what he was about to say. You have us. 3 words. She had grown up in a city full of men who spoke beautifully and meant little. She had read enough literature to know the difference between a man who reaches for the right phrase and a man who has nothing to reach for because the thing he is saying is simply what is true. She had learned over 16 days in this house something about the particular language of Caleb Hartwell, which was the language of a man who did not say things he did not mean. You have us. He meant it. She stood at the table with the ledger in front of her and the fire behind her and the blue light of the clearing sky coming through the window, and she felt for the first time since she had stood on Mrs. Hobson's porch with her bag in her hand and the wind at her back and nothing ahead of her but uncertainty, something firm under her feet. It was not safety. It was not promise. It was something older and more reliable than either of those things. It was the particular solidity of people who have decided to be present for something and mean it. She said thank you. He nodded once. Then he picked up the legal notice and folded it and put it in his coat pocket. I will want to look at the rest of that ledger, he said, tonight when Walt is in. Then he put his coat on and went back out to the ranch because there was always work to be done, and because Caleb Hartwell was not the kind of man who lingered over decisions once they had been made. Eleanor stood alone in the room for a moment. She looked at the photograph on the mantel, the young woman with the smile that was mostly for someone outside the frame. She looked at the ledger on the table, at the fire, at the window and the blue sky beyond it. She did not know yet what the ledger would eventually reveal when Caleb read it through with the knowledge he had of the land and the territory that she lacked. She did not know yet that the notations she could not decode were coordinates. She did not know yet what lay under the ground on the edge of Triple H property, or why Warren Briggs had spent 3 years and considerable patience engineering a situation that appeared on its surface to be about a debt and a woman, but was in fact about something that ran deep in silver beneath the frozen earth. She did not know any of that yet, but she put the ledger in her bag and she went to help Silas with the evening meal. And when she came to the table that night and sat down in the chair that had over 16 days quietly become hers, She sat in it with a straightness that was not performance, but something more durable. She had come 3,000 miles looking for the wrong thing in the wrong place for the wrong reasons. She was beginning to understand that this happened sometimes, and that it was not always the disaster it looked like from the platform of a train station with a death notice in your hand and the wind coming in off the territory. Sometimes it was the beginning of something else entirely. She did not know what that something else was. She was starting very quietly to want to find out. January came in without apology. The days shortened and the nights extended themselves across the Arizona territory with the patience of things that know they are in charge. The cold settled into the ground and stayed there, and the sky took on that particular shade of pale that is not quite white and not quite blue, the color of something that has been drained of warmth and is not troubled by this fact. The ridgelines that surrounded the Triple H Ranch stood sharp and dark against the snow, and the smoke from the main house chimney was the only thing moving in the mornings for as far as the eye could reach. Eleanor Hargrove had been born in a city. She had grown up with the sounds of streets and the rhythms of a neighborhood that was never fully quiet. She had expected the silence of the frontier to feel like deprivation, like something taken away. It did not feel that way. It felt in ways she had not anticipated and could not entirely explain, like permission, like the particular freedom of a place that does not require you to perform anything for anyone. The ranch made no demands on her beyond the practical. It did not ask her to be charming or decorative or careful about what she revealed of herself. It asked only that she carry her weight. And Eleanor Hargrove had been carrying her weight since she was old enough to understand that no one else was going to carry it for her. She learned this was the thing she did when the situation was new and the footing was uncertain. She watched and she asked the right questions, and she did not pretend to know things she did not know, because pretending cost more than it saved. Walt Calloway taught her to read the sky, which he did in the same unhurried way. He did everything standing beside her at the fence post in the early morning and saying things like, "The blue has gone gray. At the edges, watch the west ridge. That means it will come from the northwest by midday." He said these things without making a lesson of them, which made them land more durably than any lesson she had ever been given in a classroom. Gideon taught her to ride properly. He had decided this the second week apparently, without consulting anyone, and had simply appeared at her door one afternoon with 2 horses saddled in an expression of cheerful authority. He was not a patient teacher in the conventional sense. He did not explain things carefully before she tried them. He demonstrated once and then stepped back and let her attempt it, and when she failed, which she did consistently and with some spectacle, in the early sessions, he told her exactly what she had done wrong with the directness of someone who understands that kindness in teaching sometimes looks like honesty. She fell 3 times on the first day, once badly enough to knock the wind from her completely and lie flat on the frozen ground, looking up at a sky that seemed suddenly much further away than usual, while Gideon looked down at her from the fence rail with an expression that was mostly suppressed amusement. "The ground does not care how you land," he said. "It treats everybody the same." "That is very comforting," as she said from the ground. He helped her up. They went back to it. By the 5th day, she could ride across the length of the ranch yard without bracing herself against the horse's neck. By the 2nd week, she could manage the mare on the lower trail where the path curved around the base of the east ridge and required a kind of continuous conversation between rider and animal that had nothing to do with the reins and everything to do with weight and intent. This was what Gideon had been trying to teach her all along, she understood eventually. Not technique, understanding. Silas was building something in the connecting out building. She could hear him in the evenings, the particular music of someone who works wood with real competence, the measured tap of a mallet, and the long whisper of a hand plane, and the occasional silence that meant he was looking at something he was thinking about. She went to see what he was making one afternoon, and he was knee-deep in a project that would eventually become an extension of the kitchen shelving, and he looked up when she came in and went back to what he was doing without the awkwardness that their situation might have reasonably generated. He asked her about Boston with the genuine curiosity of a man who had spent his entire life in large open spaces and found the idea of cities intellectually fascinating in the way a person might find an unusual specimen fascinating. He wanted to know what the buildings looked like up close, whether the harbor smelled as bad as he had read, whether there were really that many people. She described what she could and found in the describing that Boston had become more vivid to her in memory than it had ever been in experience. This was the strange alchemy of distance. Silas listened to all of it with the still attention that was his particular quality, the quality of someone who receives information as though it is worth the effort. He was, she thought, a good man in the way that some men are simply good, the way certain tools are simply the right shape for the work they are made for, not through effort or performance, just structurally, essentially. Caleb moved through January the way he moved through everything, which was with a kind of deliberate forward momentum that did not slow for obstacles, but incorporated them. He checked the fence lines every morning on a route that had not changed in years. He repaired what needed repairing before it needed replacing. He made decisions without drama and without requiring the agreement of the room, and he executed those decisions with the same economy of motion that had struck Eleanor the first time she saw him dismount in the snow. He read every evening. She began to notice which books. History mostly, a few novels selected apparently with some private criteria she could not decode. He had a copy of Euclid's Elements that he treated with the seriousness some men reserve for scripture. When she mentioned one evening that she had studied geometry and found it the most honest branch of mathematics, he looked up from the Euclid with a quality of attention that was distinct from his usual measuring regard. Honest how, he said, because it requires proof, she said. You cannot simply assert a thing and expect it to stand. You have to show the work. He was quiet for a moment looking at the page. Then he said, my wife used to say something similar about people, that the ones worth knowing were the ones who showed the work. It was the first time he had mentioned her, not by name, just by the words spoken with the careful neutrality of a man who has been practicing that neutrality for a long time. Eleanor did not press. She went back to her own book. But later in her room, she thought about that sentence, about the wife who had said things worth remembering, about the photograph on the mantel with the smile that was for someone outside the frame, about the way Caleb Hartwell carried something that he did not put down, but did not wave around, either the way certain men carry their serious things close in and quiet. She thought about what it meant to be a person who showed the work. She thought she was beginning to understand why that mattered to him. The 19th of January was the coldest night of the winter. Eleanor knew this the way you know things when you live close to the weather. Not from a thermometer, but from the particular quality of the cold, the way it came through the log walls, not as a draft, but as a presence. The way the fire ate wood faster and still did not quite win the argument. She had added another blanket to her bunk and lay listening to the ranch settle and creak around her, which old buildings do on very cold nights, making their small protests. She was almost asleep when she heard the sound. It was not a sound that announced itself. It was more like the absence of a sound she had become accustomed to hearing, the ordinary quiet of the main room at night, giving way to something slightly different. She lay still for a moment. Then she got up. The main room was dark except for the ember glow of the fire that had burned down to coals. In that low orange light, she saw Caleb Hartwell, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, beneath the photograph on the mantel. His knees were drawn up. His hands were loose in his lap. He was looking at nothing in particular, with the focus and inwardness of someone who has gone somewhere far inside themselves and is not certain how to come back. He did not hear her at first. She moved to the wood box and built the fire up without making a ceremony of it, because the fire needed building regardless. Then she went to the kitchen and came back with 2 cups of coffee from the pot that was always left on the back of the stove in this household, always ready against the possibility of a cold night or a late return from the east pasture. She set 1 cup on the floor within his reach. Then she sat down against the opposite wall with her own cup, her knees drawn up the same way, and she looked at the fire. She did not ask him anything. There was nothing to ask. She had lived with grief in her own way after her father, and She knew that the most useful thing another person could offer in those moments was not words or questions or the careful performance of sympathy. It was simply presence, the signal that the night was not empty. After a while, he picked up the cup. After a longer while, he spoke. "Rebecca," he said, just the name first. Then after a pause, 3 years ago, this past November. Eleanor was still. The fire had woken up properly now and was throwing real light across the room. "Having a child," he said, "the baby first, then her. 12 hours from the beginning to the end of it. When it started, I had a wife, and in the morning I had two graves to dig, and I did not know which one to do first." The fire spoke in the silence. "We built this place together from nothing," he said. "We slept in a canvas tent the first summer while the logs dried." She never said one word about it being hard. He looked at the cup in his hands. "I have been keeping busy for 3 years. It works mostly, until nights like this one when it stops working." Eleanor looked at him across the room. In the firelight, the lines of his face were deeper than in the day, the particular depth that comes not from age, but from the accumulation of things carried. "After my father died," she said carefully, "I packed his entire apartment in 2 days. I organized the paperwork and corresponded with the lawyer and gave away what needed to go to the neighbors and arranged the furniture for the next tenant. I told myself I was being practical. I did not stop until there was nothing left to do." She paused. "And then there was nothing left to do." He looked at her, not the measuring look, something more open. "Staying busy works," she said, "until it does not." "Yes," he said. They sat with the fire between them. Outside, the cold pressed against the logs of the Triple H, and the smoke climbed from the chimney into the frozen dark, and somewhere far off in the timber, a branch gave under the weight of snow with a sound like a single sharp report. The first spring after, he said, "I plowed the East Field by myself from dawn to dark for 3 days straight because she had always helped me with the plowing, and I did not know how to do it with anyone else yet. So I did it alone until I was too tired to think about it in the right way." A pause. "That field had the best yield of any year we have had." "She would have liked that," Eleanor said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, she would have." They stayed until the fire had settled into steady warmth and the worst of the cold had retreated from the corners of the room. Then Eleanor said goodnight simply and without ceremony and went back to her room. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about the word "we," about the particular way he had used it. "We slept in a tent. We built this." The ease of that word in his mouth, the way it had lived there for years, and the way it must have felt when it stopped being accurate. She thought about the photograph. She thought about showing the work. She did not know yet what she was beginning to feel. Or rather, she suspected she knew and was not yet ready to examine the knowledge directly. She was by training and by temperament a woman who required evidence before conclusions. She was gathering evidence. She was not yet sure what it was evidence of. She filed it all carefully and went to sleep. The wolves came at the end of January. Walt had seen the signs first the way he saw most things before anyone else. The overlapping tracks around the chicken coop that were too large for coyote, the single ewe found at the fence line on Thursday morning. He reported it to Caleb with the unhurried precision of someone delivering information that requires attention but not panic. Then he mentioned it had been 3 days running. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard this. She went on with what she was doing and did not say anything. But she began paying attention to the distances at dusk, the quality of the dark at the tree line, the behavior of the horses in their stalls when the evening wind changed direction. She had learned in 2 months on this ranch that the animals knew things before the people did, and that the people who paid attention to the animals knew things before the people who did not. By the end of the week, she had established, without telling anyone she was doing it, that the pack was moving their perimeter tighter each night. They were testing. Animals that are hungry enough test things they would not otherwise test. She knew this from Walt, who had mentioned it in passing one afternoon in the context of a story about a hard winter 6 years back that she had filed and retained. The night they came was the last night of January. Not midnight as such attacks are imagined to occur in stories, but closer to 2 in the morning when the cold is deepest and the dark is thickest, and the impulse to remain in your warm bunk is at its most persuasive. Eleanor's room was at the end of the connecting hallway closest to the back of the outbuilding, and the nearest of all the sleeping quarters to the barn. She heard the horses. Buck Caleb's roan made a sound she had not heard him make before. Not the ordinary shifting and stamping of a horse settling in its stall. Something more urgent and more specific. And immediately after it, the frantic scramble of the chickens, which made the sound of panic rather than the ordinary sound of disturbance. She was out of her bunk before she had fully thought about being out of her bunk. She had her coat on in the dark by feel. She took the long-handled axe handle that Walt had shown her 3 weeks ago, hung by the back door for precisely this kind of emergency, and she went through the back door into the cold and the dark. 5 wolves. She counted them in the first second the way you count what threatens you before you decide what to do about it. They were in the space between the outbuilding and the barn, gray shapes low to the ground in the thin moonlight circling the barn doors, with the focused efficiency of animals that have made a decision and are implementing it. One had already found the weak section of the chicken coop wall and was working at it. She did not think about being afraid. There would be time for that later, presumably. Right now, there was only the fact of the wolves in the distance to the barn and the noise she needed to make immediately. She brought the axe handle down hard against the wooden wall of the outbuilding. Once, twice, 3 times, a flat cracking sound that rang out through the still night like a hammer on an anvil. At the same time, she called out loud and sharp in the voice she had discovered she possessed. During her first week of lessons with Gideon, the voice he had told her to find the voice that started from somewhere below the chest. The nearest wolf flinched back. The others checked. The sound had come from the wrong direction and at the wrong register, and they needed a moment to recalculate. That moment was enough. The main door of the ranch house came open hard, and Caleb Hartwell came through it with his Winchester already in his hands, which meant he had not been entirely asleep when it started, or had slept in the manner of men who live far from help and have trained themselves to wake ready. Behind him came Silas with a pistol, and the big oil lantern from the kitchen hooked the one that threw light in a wide circle rather than a beam. And behind Silas Gideon, with nothing in his hands but moving with the specific intent of someone heading for the east side of the barn, the side you could not see from the main doors, the angle that represented the second approach. This was the thing Eleanor understood later, when the cold had released some of its grip on her, thinking they had a system. Not discussed in advance for this specific night, because you cannot discuss everything in advance, but built from years of working together in a place where being unprepared was the same as being wrong, and being wrong had real costs. They knew each other's instincts the way musicians in a long-running ensemble know each other's timing. They fell into the geometry of it without a word. Caleb took the nearest wolf, the one that had been at the chicken coop. One shot. The sound went through the night like the sky breaking. The pack scattered back 10 feet, enough for Silas to establish the lantern's perimeter, enough for Eleanor to move to his right flank, where the light dropped off and she could see the movement at the fence line. Gideon had gone alone around the east side of the barn. This was the riskiest position, and he had taken it without discussion, because the youngest Hartwell brother had a quality that could charitably be called fearlessness, and less charitably called a constitutional inability to consider consequences before acting on instinct. In his case, this quality had been tempered by enough genuine competence that it mostly worked out. The pack tested the perimeter twice more in the next 10 minutes. Caleb put down a second wolf that came too close to the fence where the horses were beginning to seriously consider their own options. The rest pulled back to the tree line and stayed there, visible in the darkness as a set of paired reflections watching. They held the perimeter until dawn began to suggest itself in the east, that first tentative gray that is not yet light but is the promise of it. And then with a gradual brightening, the wolves disappeared back into the timber the way they had come. The chicken coop had lost its weakest section of wall and 4 hens. The barn was intact. Buck had gotten a cut on his right foreleg from something in the panic not serious, Silas's assessment as he worked on it in the lantern light. Everything else that mattered was whole. They gathered in the kitchen by the fire because the cold outside had done its work on all of them during the previous 2 hours. Walt had appeared from his own quarters at some point during the action and was now making coffee with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who understands that hot coffee is always the correct immediate response to a difficult night. Caleb looked at Eleanor. "You went out first," he said. "My room is closest to the barn," she said, without a weapon. "I had the axe handle." Gideon made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly the release of tension that builds up when you have been standing alone on the dark side of a barn while wolves reconsider their options. Silas looked at Eleanor with the specific expression he wore when he was revising something upward. Caleb did not laugh. He looked at her for a long moment with that quality of attention she had been cataloging for 2 months, and she watched something shift in it. The measurement was still there, but the measurement was measuring something different now. Something it was arriving at rather than still working out. "The noise you made," he said. "Where did you learn that?" "Gideon," she said. Gideon at this sat up slightly straighter with the satisfaction of someone whose instruction has been vindicated. Caleb looked at his youngest brother for a moment. Then he looked back at Eleanor. He nodded once. Then he picked up his coffee and turned toward the window to look at the gray light coming up over the east ridge. She watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the way he stood at windows as though the horizon were something he was in an ongoing conversation with. She put her hands around her coffee cup and told herself the warmth she felt was entirely from the cup. It was 2 days after the wolf night that Silas found Caleb alone in the barn. Eleanor was in the kitchen. She would not know what was said for some time, and when she eventually learned the substance of it, it would come in pieces and not all at once, but she would understand its significance. Silas had watched things as he always watched things, quietly and from close range and without announcing that he was watching. He had been watching since the first week of January, since the evening with the book in the conversation about what novels were really explaining, since the morning after Caleb had come inside at dawn, looking like a man who had slept in the dark instead of his bed. He had watched, and he had been honest with himself in the way that certain men of genuine character manage to be honest with themselves even about the things that are inconvenient. He had felt something for Eleanor Hargrove, not merely the practical regard of a man living alongside a woman who had turned out to be more capable and more real than circumstances had promised. Something more specific and more personal. He had recognized it. He had watched it develop with the same attention he gave to everything, and he had let it develop because he had not yet decided what to do about it. And then incrementally through December and into January, he had also watched his brother. Caleb did not do obvious things. He was not given to displays. The changes in him were the kind that required close attention to notice changes in the direction of attention, the slight shifts in what he chose to say, and when he chose to say it, the quality of silence when Eleanor was in the room versus the quality of silence when she was not. These were not changes Caleb himself was narrating. They were changes that were happening in him the way seasons happen without announcement beneath the surface of everything visible. Silas went to the barn because the barn was where the two of them had always had the conversations that mattered. Going back to before the Triple H had been the Triple H, and they were boys on their father's land learning how to be men. He said what he had to say directly. He had felt something for Eleanor Hargrove. He was telling Caleb because Caleb was his brother and there should not be concealment between them about something of this weight. And he was also telling him because in watching both of them over 2 months in close quarters, he had arrived at a conclusion that he was going to name out loud because the thing about Silas Hartwell was that he believed in naming things out loud when the alternative was leaving them to fester in the dark. He had seen the way Caleb had gone to the window after Eleanor told him she might have money to go back to Boston. He had seen the way Caleb said, "I understand," and meant both the words and the thing that was behind the words that he was not saying. He was stepping aside, Silas told his brother, not because he was defeated, not because he had lost some unspoken competition. because he was 40 feet of honest ground, and he knew the topography of this situation, and he knew where the water ran. There was a long silence in the barn after he finished. Then Caleb said, "She may still go in the spring." "She may," Silas said. "That is her decision." "Yes," Silas said. "It is." Another silence. The horses shifted. Walt was visible through the barn door working on something at the fence with his back turned, which was entirely characteristic of Walt. Caleb looked at his brother for a long time. Then he said, "You are a better man than I deserve for a brother." "I know," Silas said. They did not speak of it again. But something in the house settled differently after that day, in ways that Eleanor could sense without being able to name the way you can sense when a room has been rearranged even before you can identify what has been moved. February arrived, and the first sustained thaw brought the possibility of the road to Red Rock. Caleb decided they would all go in together for supplies. Eleanor knew when he said it that this was not only about supplies. She had been in Arizona long enough to understand that in a territory where distance was the default, a man choosing to make the longer journey rather than the shorter one was usually making a statement along with his travel arrangements. The town looked different to her than it had when she arrived in December. She had arrived then as someone to whom everything was new and most of it threatening. She came back now as someone who had eaten at the Triple H table for 8 weeks and ridden the East Trail in cold weather and stood in a snowy dark with wolves at the perimeter. The town was not larger. She was different from when she had last stood in it. Mrs. Clara Dawson's shop was the fourth building on the left side of the main street, identified by a wooden sign that had been painted with more care than most of the signage in Red Rock. The letters even and well-spaced, the kind of work done by someone who believed that the standard of a thing reflected the character of the person who made it. Eleanor had been directed there by Gideon, who had said simply that Clara Dawson was the person in this town who would tell her the truth about things. Inside the shop was warm and smelled of fabric and beeswax and the particular indoor smell of a place that has been well maintained over many years. Clara Dawson was perhaps 45 with silver threading through her dark hair and hands that moved with the assurance of someone whose work was precise and who had made peace with the fact that precision took the time it took. She looked at Eleanor with eyes that were neither suspicious nor performatively welcoming. Just clear. "You are from the Hartwell Ranch," she said. It was not a question. "I am," Eleanor said. "Sit down," Clara said. "I have been waiting for someone to come to me instead of waiting for me to come to them." She poured tea. She spoke plainly. She told Eleanor what she needed to know about Warren Briggs, which was more than Eleanor had known and less than she still needed to find out. She told her which of the people in Red Rock could be trusted and which ones were in Briggs's arrangement financially or otherwise. She told her about the Hartwell brothers, which was that, in her observation, they were honest men in a territory where honest men were a specific and finite resource and needed to be noticed when found. She told her one more thing. She was sending a letter to the U.S. Marshal's office in Tucson. She had been gathering documentation for 4 weeks since the night she had heard from 3 separate sources about the fire set on the Keating homestead north of town, which Briggs's men had set when the Keatings would not sell their water rights. She had written careful notes, she had names, she had dates. She needed one more source to make the documentation strong enough to warrant the response she was asking for. The ledger, Eleanor understood. Clara meant the ledger. They were still talking when she heard the voices outside. She came out of Clara's shop to find Deputy Mac Foster and a large man she knew by name as Crane blocking the middle of the street. Foster was holding a folded document with the manner of a man who has been told he has legal authority and has not been required to test this claim very often. Crane was standing with his arms at his sides in the way of men whose usefulness is more physical than organizational. "Miss Eleanor Hargrove," Foster said with the studied formality of someone reading from a prepared text inside his own head, "I am directed by the county to request your presence at the sheriff's office to address the matter of outstanding contractual obligations." Eleanor did not move. You can ride, Crane said, without the formality, looking at her with the flat, evaluative regard of someone assessing not a legal matter, but a practical one. The voice came from behind her. She is right here. The street went quiet in the way that streets go quiet when something with weight has entered the space. Caleb Hartwell was standing in the middle of the road with Silas and Gideon arranged beside him in the unconscious geometry of men who have stood alongside each other in difficult circumstances more than once. He was not reaching for anything. His hands were loose and visible. He was simply standing there with the quality of presence he always had, which in this context was the quality of a very large and very still object that would require considerably more than a deputy and an enforcer to move. Foster recalculated. This was visible in his face. Hartwell, he said, shifting, register, this is not your affair. Any legal matter involving someone under this ranch's protection requires a proper attorney present before anyone goes anywhere, Caleb said. He said it without raising his voice with the same even tone he used for everything. If you have a valid order, present it through the right channel. If you are standing in the street making requests, we are going home. Crane took a half step forward. Gideon took a half step forward, matching it exactly at the same speed with an expression of such complete and almost cheerful readiness that Crane stopped and spent a moment reconsidering the specific parameters of his instructions. The street held. Foster looked at Caleb. He looked at the document in his hand. He looked at the faces of the people on the boardwalk who had stopped their ordinary afternoon business to watch the way small towns would always watch when their particular civic theater enters a dramatic passage. He put the document back in his coat. Briggs will not be pleased, he said. Send him our regards, Gideon said with a warmth that was entirely unconvincing. They rode back to the Triple H in the late afternoon, the four of them, with the supply wagon following behind. Gideon brought his horse up beside Eleanor's on the long straight section where the road ran between two frozen meadows, the section where in spring there would be wildflowers, but in February there was only the blue distance and the white ground. Can I ask you something? Gideon said. Yes, Eleanor said. He looked at the trail ahead for a moment. Did you notice what Caleb said back there? I noticed what he said. He said under this ranch's protection, he has not said that about any person since Rebecca died. Gideon paused, not for effect, but for accuracy, the pause of someone making sure they are saying the precise thing. He used to say it about her. When someone in town said something he did not like about her being from back east and not knowing frontier ways, he would say she is under this ranch's protection and there would be no more conversation about it. Eleanor kept her eyes on the trail. He stopped saying it about people after she was gone, Gideon said. I think because saying it about someone and then losing them is a particular kind of difficult. He let that sit for a moment. I just thought you should know, he said. Then he pulled his horse ahead with the breezy purposefulness of someone who has delivered his message and considers his work complete. Eleanor rode on through the cold blue afternoon, and she thought about the word protection, about what it cost a man like Caleb Hartwell to use it again, about what it meant that he had. She thought about this for a long time. The legal papers came on the 17th of February, not a rider this time, an official packet delivered by the county courier who made the Red Rock Circuit official business, only sealed with the county seal and left with Walt at the gate. Walt brought it inside and set it on the table without expression, which was consistent with his standard operating procedure for anything he had decided was above his appointed jurisdiction. Caleb read it at the table with the focused stillness he brought to all serious reading. Then he passed it to Silas and stood up and went to the window. Eleanor read over Silas's shoulder. There were two parts to the document. The first was a civil claim filed by Briggs's attorneys against Eleanor Hargrove, reiterating the $180 debt and now adding 3 weeks of accumulated interest calculated in a way that suggested familiarity with the upper limit of what a friendly judge might accept. The legal standing was thin, as Caleb had said from the beginning, but thin legal standing in a territory where the nearest impartial judge was a long ride away and the local judiciary had known financial relationships with Warren Briggs was not the same as no legal standing. The second part of the document was the part that changed the air in the room. It was a land use claim formally filed and carrying the signatures of two witnesses and a notary. It stated that Owen Greer, in settlement of debts owed to Colonel Warren Briggs, had signed over the use rights to a parcel of land adjacent to the north boundary of the Triple H Ranch. The parcel described included the section of terrain through which the seasonal creek ran, the creek that in summer fed the upper pasture where the Hartwells ran the majority of their cattle during the dry months. Without access to that creek in summer, the upper pasture was a liability rather than an asset. Without the upper pasture, the carrying capacity of the ranch dropped by more than a third. It was not a death blow. It was a slow one. Owen Greer had no right to that land, Silas said. He said it with a quietness that was more serious than volume. He did not, Caleb said. But Briggs is not trying to win in court. He is trying to force us into a fight that costs us time and money and attention while summer comes. Eleanor was looking at the claim. Something was turning itself over in her mind, something she had been close to understanding for weeks. The parcel described the north boundary. Shiny, the notation in the ledger, she had not been able to decode the one that looked like grid references, the kind of spatial notation a man would use if he were marking a location rather than an amount. She looked at Caleb's back at the window. The ledger, she said. He turned. The sections I could not read, she said. The shorthand. I think those might be survey coordinates. The room was quiet. For what? Silas said slowly. I do not know, Eleanor said. But Owen Greer was being paid by Briggs, not for services in general, for something specific, something that was tied to a location. She looked at Caleb. The parcel he is claiming, the north boundary land. Has anyone surveyed it recently? Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, Walt. And Walt, who had been standing in the doorway to the kitchen for the last several minutes in the manner of a man who has been listening to a conversation he was not invited to, but considers himself professionally obligated to attend, said, I will ride to Anderson's in the morning. Anderson was the retired mining surveyor who lived 7 miles east. This was mentioned without further explanation because in a house where everyone had been paying attention to things without necessarily discussing them, certain pieces of information were already assembled. They only needed the right question to connect them. Walt left in the morning. That same morning, while Eleanor was sorting through the papers on the table, and Gideon was in the barn, and Silas was in the outbuilding running a plane across a board with long, even strokes, Caleb came in from the east pasture and stopped at the table and looked at the envelope that had arrived with the official packet. A separate envelope, smaller, addressed to Eleanor alone, bearing a Boston postmark. She had not told him it was there. She had not opened it yet. He looked at the envelope, and then he looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. She opened it. The letter was from the office of the attorney who had handled her father's estate. There was a policy, he wrote, that had come to light during a final review of her father's papers. A small life insurance policy taken out years ago that had been overlooked in the initial settlement because the certificate had been filed separately from his other documents and had not been found until recently. The value of the policy after fees and administrative costs came to approximately $310. The attorney asked for her instructions regarding the disbursement. $310. Enough for passage home, enough for a room and several months of careful living while she found work. Enough to begin again in a city she knew with skills she had in the life she had left. She held the letter and read it twice. Then she set it on the table. Caleb had moved to the window. She could not see his face. She could see his shoulders, the width of them, the slight change in how he was holding himself. You can go, he said. His voice was level, entirely level, the voice of a man who has decided how to speak before he speaks. I know, she said. There is nothing here that keeps you. She looked at his back, at the window beyond him, the pale February sky, the frozen east ridge, the smoke from the chimney trailing horizontally in the wind. Nothing here that keeps you. She thought about showing the work, about what it cost a man to say those words when he did not entirely mean them. Or rather, when he meant them in the sense of meaning what was true, but not in the sense of meaning what he wanted. She thought about a photograph on a mantle and 2 graves and 3 years of keeping busy until nights when it stopped working. She thought about a hand extended in the snow and the warmth of it, in the way she had known even then that it was more than the cold that made her notice. I have not decided, she said. A pause. You have time, he said. He did not turn from the window. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. She went back to the papers on the table and continued sorting through them. He stayed at the window for another minute, and then he went back outside. Gideon appeared in the doorway from the barn shortly after. He leaned against the frame in the manner of someone who happened to be passing and stopped by coincidence. Walt is back, he said. Eleanor looked up. Anderson was not home, Gideon said. Gone to the land office in Tucson. Walt will try again in the morning. Eleanor set the legal papers down. She looked at the ledger in her hand. The coordinates she could not fully decode. The payments she could read but not entirely explain. The whole shape of the thing that she was beginning to see but could not yet prove. She put the Boston letter in her coat pocket. She picked up the legal papers in the ledger. She went to find Caleb. Because whatever was in that coat pocket and whatever waited in Boston and whatever she was still sorting out about the man she was going to find standing somewhere on his own land, looking at his own horizon, she had come to understand something over the past 2 months in the particular school of a hard winter in an honest place. She was not someone who left when the ground got difficult. She had never been that person. She was only now beginning to understand that she did not have to apologize for it. March came in without ceremony. The thaw was not a dramatic thing. It was not a single morning of warmth or a decisive break in the sky. It was incremental and stubborn, the way real change always is working at the edges. First, the south-facing slopes where the sun reached longest, the creek banks where the ice thinned from underneath before it showed any weakness on the surface. You could feel it in the quality of the light more than anything else, a different angle, a different weight, something in the late afternoon that was not there in February, and that told the body before the mind had finished calculating that the world was turning back toward warmth. Eleanor noticed it on the second day of March, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, while Caleb and Silas were working on the fence line beyond the barn. She noticed it and felt something that she did not immediately name a change in the barometric pressure of her own chest, some small door that had been held shut against the winter beginning to ease. The letter from Boston was still in her coat pocket. She had not sent a reply. Walt Calloway returned from Anderson's on the 4th day of March with a look on his face that Eleanor had not seen before. Walt was not a man who allowed the outside of himself to report on the inside with any regularity. But there was something in how he came through the door and set his hat on the peg and sat down at the table and waited for the room to be right that communicated even before he spoke that what he was carrying was more than an ordinary piece of information. Caleb came in from outside when he saw Walt's horse in the yard. Walt set something on the table. It was a piece of rock about the size of a man's fist, irregular in shape, pale gray with a surface that caught the afternoon light and threw it back with a warmth that was different from reflected sunlight, something that lived in the rock rather than on it. Anderson had been direct, Walt reported. He had known the geology of that particular stretch of the North Parcel for some years, had walked it once doing informal survey work for a land office inquiry that had come to nothing. He had suspected then. What he saw in the piece of rock was confirmation rather than discovery. The formation ran through the north section on a bearing that, if it held, meant a seam of real breadth. High-grade material, the kind of find that changed the financial arithmetic of any operation that controlled the land above it. Walt finished speaking. The room was quiet. Gideon looked at the piece of rock on the table. He reached out and picked it up and held it in the afternoon light and set it back down without saying anything. This was unusual for Gideon, who had opinions about most things and communicated them promptly. Eleanor was looking at Caleb. He was looking at the table, not at the rock specifically, but at the space around it, the way a man looks at a problem he has been working at from the wrong angle and has just understood which angle was right all along. He has known, Caleb said. Has to have known. Walt agreed. For some time. My guess is before he set the first arrangement with Owen Greer. Could be longer than that. Eleanor looked at the piece of rock on the table. She thought about the coordinates in the ledger that she had not been able to fully decode, about the payments from Briggs to Greer that she had read but not entirely understood. The whole shape of it was assembling itself now piece by piece, the way a picture comes together when you finally have enough of the parts. Owen Greer had not been a debtor struggling to stay afloat. He had been a placeholder positioned and paid to sit on the land adjacent to the Triple H until the time came to use him. And she had been the final piece of the arrangement, a woman with no resources and no standing who was supposed to arrive and become the complication that tipped the balance. 3 years of patience, 3 years of groundwork, all of it for this. He will move before spring thaw, Caleb said. He knows Anderson is out here. He knows we know. Silas was looking at the piece of rock. What do you want to do? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up. Tonight I am going to read through that ledger from the beginning, every page, with Anderson's survey bearing in mind. He looked at Walt. Can Anderson be in Red Rock on the 15th? Walt said he could arrange that. Caleb looked at Eleanor. The letter to the county seat. Can you write it? She had been writing letters since she was 8 years old. Her father had believed in the precision of language as a practical tool, not an ornamental one. She could write a letter that said exactly what it needed to say and nothing extra. Yes, she said. Include the ledger references, the coordinates, Anderson's assessment. He paused. There is a federal marshal out of Tucson who has been making inquiries in the territory. His name is Thomas Reeves. I have heard his name in connection with land fraud cases. If the letter goes to the right desk, it will reach him. It was the most words Caleb Hartwell had spoken consecutively since Eleanor had arrived at the Triple H, and the room treated them accordingly, receiving them with the attention they warranted. That night after supper, she wrote the letter. She wrote it at the big table by the lamplight, while Caleb read through the ledger beside her, occasionally saying a number or a notation quietly, and she would incorporate it into the letter without discussion, the two of them working in the efficient parallel of people whose thinking has become overtime compatible without effort. Gideon had looked at this arrangement twice during the evening. The second time he looked at Silas, and Silas had given him a steady look in return that communicated without words that the correct thing to do was to go back to whatever he was doing. Gideon went back to it. Walt took the letter to Red Rock the following morning. Then came the fire. It arrived on the night of the 8th of March, and it came the way trouble comes when it wants to send a message rather than do maximum damage. Not the house, not the barn, the stand of timber on the north edge of the property, the old growth section that had been there before the ranch existed, the trees that Caleb's father had refused to log because he said a man needed to be able to look at something that had been standing longer than his troubles. Eleanor woke to the smell before anything else. Not wood smoke from the fireplace, but the rawer, wilder smell of an open burn, the kind that comes from outside and carries distance with it. She was out of her room and through the connecting door before she had identified all the elements of what she was smelling. They were all already moving when she got to the main room. Walt had seen the glow from his window and had started for the water buckets before anyone else was awake. Caleb was at the back door assessing the wind direction with the focused attention of a man running calculations very quickly. The fire was upwind of the barn and the house. It was not an accident of proximity. It was set at the precise location that would make its message clear while keeping the machinery of a legal response unavailable. They worked for 2 hours in the dark, all 5 of them with buckets and a wet canvas that had been kept in the barn for this possibility, working the edges of the burn and keeping it from spreading to the adjacent section. The night was cold enough that their breath came out in clouds, and the water from the buckets half froze before it reached the ground on the far side of the clearing. The timber stand lost 12 trees on its southern edge. In the morning in the gray light, Caleb stood at the edge of the burn and looked at what had been there the night before and was not there now. His face did not do the thing that faces do when they are performing grief or anger for an audience. It did the thing that faces do when grief or anger is private, which is almost nothing. A slight tightening at the jaw, a particular quality of stillness. Eleanor came and stood beside him. She did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say about 12 trees that had been growing for longer than anyone on the property had been alive. So she stood there in the gray morning while the smell of the burn worked at the cold air around them, and she was present for it the way she had been present on the floor of the main room in January without making a performance of presence. After a while, Caleb said, "He is out of patience." "Yes," she said. "That means he is also out of good options." She thought about this, about what it meant that a man who had spent 3 years laying careful groundwork had abandoned patience for a signal fire in the timber. It meant the letter had been sent in time. It meant Warren Briggs knew that the arithmetic was changing and was trying to change it back with the only tool he had left, which was the blunt instrument of intimidation. A man who has good options does not set fires. "The 15th, Caleb said. She understood what he meant. "He will come before Anderson can testify." "Yes." She looked at the burned timber. 12 trees that had been here before any of them. Then she looked at the Triple H visible from here, the square lines of it, the stone chimney, the fence lines running out in their orderly directions across the frozen ground. The place that had been built board by people who intended to stay. "Then we will be ready on the 15th, she said. The 15th of March arrived with the first real warmth of the year. It came in the morning, that warmth, just a quality of the air that was different from anything that had come before it this season, a softening, a sense that the long argument between winter and the world was finally beginning to resolve in the world's favor. The snow on the south slope of the east ridge was pulling back from the rock, and in the yard the mud was showing, for the first time in months, the good dark mud that meant the ground was coming back to life beneath its surface. Eleanor was in the garden plot she had been preparing since early March. It was too early to plant most things. But it was not too early to work the soil to turn it and break the frost out of the top layers and work in the ash from the winter fires, which Wold had told her the ground needed after a hard season. She had been doing this in the mornings for 2 weeks, methodically working her way from the south end of the plot toward the north, because the work was good and because the ground needed it, and because, if she was honest with herself, it was the thing she did with her hands when the rest of her was working through something complicated. She heard Walt's voice first. She stood up. He was at the gatepost on the high ground, which gave him the best view of the road from Red Rock. And he had his hand over his eyes, the way you put your hand over your eyes when you are trying to count something moving in the distance. 15, he said, then maybe 18. She set down her tools. Warren Briggs led them in on a dark horse, dressed as he always dressed when he came to demonstrate something which was with the particular precision of a man who understands that appearance is part of the argument. He was flanked by Mac Foster on his right and Crane on his left, and behind them came 12 more men who had the look of hired muscle rather than legitimate law enforcement, which was what they were. The yard of the Triple H was quiet when they rode in. The horses in the barn had heard them coming and were making their awareness of it known, but otherwise the morning held its character. The drip of the eaves as the frost came off the roof, the wind very light from the south. Caleb came out of the main house door. Silas and Gideon took up positions on either side of the door, not position for aggression, but position with the clear understanding of men who have thought about where they need to be and why. Walt came around from the direction of the barn at an unhurried pace that nevertheless brought him to a tactically useful position at the corner of the main building. Eleanor looked at the spade still in her hand. She set it against the fence post and walked out of the garden. She came and stood beside Caleb. Briggs looked at her and then at Caleb and then at the arrangement of the people before him. He was doing arithmetic as all men in his position do. He was running the numbers on what he had brought and what he was looking at and what the day was going to cost or yield, depending on the outcome. "Hartwell," he said. His voice was the voice of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room he occupied. "I have come to conclude our business." "State your business," Caleb said. "The same business as always." He did not look at Eleanor when he spoke about her, which was its own form of contempt. the kind that does not acknowledge enough to grant the acknowledgement. The woman honors her obligation or she rides with me. The land use claim is settled by your signature on the document I have here. These are simple terms. Caleb said no. One word. Delivered with the same even weight he gave to everything. Not defiant in the theatrical sense. Simply accurate. Briggs moved his horse forward one step. Behind him, Crane and two others nudged their horses toward the barn, the motion of men who have been told to take up positions before the conversation reaches its end. Eleanor heard Walt shift his weight at the corner of the building, and then she heard something else. Hoofbeats from the east road. Not one horse and not two, a group moving at a sustained pace that spoke of purpose rather than urgency. She watched Briggs's face as he heard them. To watch the small recalculation that happened there, the thing behind his eyes that was not quite certainty anymore. Mrs. Clara Dawson came first. She came on her brown horse with her back straight and her hands easy on the reins, the posture of a woman who has decided where she is going and is not in a hurry because she already knows she will arrive. Behind her came Anderson, the mining surveyor, with his leather document case across his saddle. Behind Anderson came the Peterson family father and two grown sons from the ranch 4 miles north. Behind them more. The school teacher from the Red Rock Community Hall. Two families Eleanor recognized from the town. More faces she was still learning. 12 people, 14, 17. Clara pulled her horse up 10 feet from where Briggs sat his. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The crowd behind her was a kind of voice in itself. Warren, she said with the directness of a woman who has been using a man's first name since before he had the money to expect a title. I have documentation here for the territorial governor's office and for the federal marshal's district representing sworn statements from 14 residents of this county describing conduct that constitutes fraud, intimidation, and criminal damage to property. She held up the packet, not waving it, just making its existence a visible fact. Anderson has a survey assessment that contradicts every claim your attorneys have filed regarding that land parcel. I also want to note that I sent a writer to Tucson 2 weeks ago. From the northern approach, the sound of a single horse at a deliberate pace. The man who rode in was 40 years old, weathered the way frontier law enforcement weathers, with the particular economy of movement that comes from many years of arriving in situations where reading the room quickly is a professional requirement. His badge caught the morning light once as he turned his horse to survey the arrangement of people in the yard. Thomas Reeves, he said to the yard in general and to no one in particular, United States Marshal Tucson District. He looked at Briggs with the mild attentiveness of someone who has been introduced to a name before meeting the face and is now confirming that the face matches what the name suggested. Colonel, I have been looking forward to this conversation for some weeks. The yard held its silence. Briggs sat his horse. He was a man who had arrived at his position in the world by understanding leverage, and he was doing what such a man does when the leverage shifts, which is to take a full and accurate inventory of what has actually changed before committing to a response. The document in Clara Dawson's hand. Anderson and his leather case, a federal marshal who had been in the territory for weeks, 14 county residents who were in his debt or afraid of him or both and had come anyway. He looked at Caleb Hartwell standing in front of his house with the people of his life arranged around him, and he understood something that men like Warren Briggs eventually have to understand, which is that a man who has built actual things, actual loyalty, actual honest obligation, possesses a kind of leverage that money can approach, but cannot simply purchase. We can resolve this through the appropriate legal channels, Briggs said. His voice had shifted registers, still controlled, still the voice of a man who expects to be listened to, but with something underneath it now that had not been there before. The sound of a man who is managing the distance between where he intended to arrive and where he has actually arrived. Yes, Marshal Reeves said pleasantly. We can. My office this afternoon. The men behind Briggs were already doing their own arithmetic. Crane was looking at the assembled crowd with an expression that suggested His particular calculations about the day's prospects had recently been revised. Foster had found something of absorbing interest in the middle distance. Briggs turned his horse. He did not speak again. He did not look at Caleb or at Eleanor or at any of them. He rode back the way he had come with his men behind him, and the morning received them back without ceremony, the sound of hoofbeats diminishing into the ordinary sounds of a spring day, the drip of eaves, the light wind from the south, the horses in the barn making their quieter sounds now that the strange horses were going. Clara Dawson watched him go. Then she looked at Eleanor with the clear eyes of a woman who has done what she came to do and is content with the work. She did not make a production of the moment. She simply nodded once. Eleanor nodded back. Anderson dismounted and went to find Caleb, and the two of them stood near the barn for 20 minutes with Anderson's papers spread across the top rail of the fence, going over coordinates in the voice of men for whom the subject is both urgent and satisfying in equal measure. Marshal Reeves accepted coffee from Silas and sat at the table and asked measured questions and listened to the answers with the attention of a man who is building something from the materials the conversation provides. He stayed for most of the afternoon. Before he left, he told Caleb that the land use claim would not survive scrutiny and that the civil case against Miss Hargrove would be dismissed at first hearing, given the documented circumstances of its origin. He said Briggs was not finished in the territory, but he was finished with the Triple H Ranch and finished with the woman from Boston, and that was the part that mattered most for today. He rode out in the late afternoon light, and the yard of the Triple H Ranch was quiet again, and the south wind was warm enough by then that no one standing in it needed to pull a coat tighter. Eleanor stood at the garden fence for a while after everyone had gone. She looked at the soil she had been working, the turned earth, the beginning of something. She looked at the ridge to the east with its retreating snow line, the rock showing dark and clean where the winter had been. She looked at the cottonwood tree at the western corner of the yard, the old one with the first faint smoke of green at the tips of its highest branches that she had noticed 2 days ago and had not yet said anything about to anyone. She took the letter from Boston out of her coat pocket. She read it one last time. Then she folded it and held it and stood there for a moment with the warm wind at her back and the turned earth before her. She put it back in her pocket. She went inside to help Silas with the evening meal. It was Gideon who created the conditions for what happened next. He did not do this intentionally, or rather he did it with precisely the intentionality that Gideon Hartwell always brought to things, which was the kind that does not announce itself as intentionality, but is transparently exactly that. 3 evenings after the confrontation with Briggs, he announced at supper that he needed to check on the horses and that Silas should probably come because there was something wrong with the way the gray mare was favoring her right foreleg. He said this while looking at neither Silas nor the direction of the barn, which was the tell. Silas looked at his brother for a moment. Then he put his napkin on the table and stood up and went with Gideon to the barn, and Walt followed them because Walt had been on this earth long enough to recognize a contrived exit when he saw one and was sufficiently invested in the outcome to assist in its construction. The main room was quiet. Caleb was still at the table. Eleanor was still at the table. The lamp was lit and the fire was going, and the evening had the particular quality of a thing that has been arranged. Eleanor put the letter on the table between them. Not to show him, not to discuss it, just to make it visible the way you make something visible when you have been carrying it privately for too long, and it is time for it to be in the room rather than only inside you. He looked at it. He did not touch it. I have made my decision, she said. He was still. The fire spoke in the quiet room. I am not going back to Boston. She had thought about how to say the next part. She had composed several versions in her mind over the preceding weeks and rejected all of them because they had the quality of speeches, and speeches were not the right instrument for this conversation, which needed to be something else, something closer to showing the work. I came here looking for the wrong thing, she said. I came looking for stability, for a practical arrangement that would solve a practical problem. I was honest with myself about that at the time. I thought honesty about your reasons was the same as wisdom about your reasons. She paused. It is not always the same thing. He was looking at her with the quality of attention she had come to know over 4 months, the attention that received things fully and did not hurry toward response. I have been living in this house long enough to understand what was built here. Not the logs and the fence lines, the other things, the way you work and what you protect and what you will not put down even when it costs you to carry it. She looked at her hands on the table. I have been thinking about what your wife said, about people who show the work. He was very still. I think you are that kind of person, she said. And I think I am also that kind of person. And I think that when two people who are that kind of person find themselves at the same table in the same difficult winter, that is not only circumstance. She looked at him. I want to stay, she said, not because I have nowhere to go. I have somewhere to go. I want to stay because this is where I want to be. That is a different thing. It is the only thing I am certain is true right now, and I thought you should hear it directly rather than understand it by inference. Caleb Hartwell sat across from her at the table that he had built with his own hands. In the second year of the Triple H, in the room that had held his life for a decade, the room where the fire had gone on through every hard thing, and the photograph on the mantle had witnessed every conversation and every silence, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he stood up and came around the table. He said, I have not slept through a night since January without waking up at some point and thinking about the spring and what it would look like if you were not here. He said, I told myself it was not a fair thing to want, that you came here because circumstances drove you here, and a man does not mistake necessity for choice. He said, but you are standing here telling me it is a choice. She said. Then I want to tell you something I have not known how to say without it being unfair. He looked at her with the particular directness of a man who has decided to be without defense about something for the first time in a long time. I carried Rebecca with me every day for 3 years, and I will carry her for the rest of my life. And I do not believe that diminishes what I am saying right now. I think love does not divide. I think it expands. He took her hand from the table. I would like you to stay, he said. Not because the ranch needs you, not because circumstances recommend it, because I have been watching you for 4 months and I have seen who you are, and who you are is someone I would choose. If choosing is what this is. It is what this is, she said. The barn door was not quite closed, and the voices from inside it were not quite inaudible. And from somewhere within that imperfectly closed door came the sound of Gideon Hartwell saying something enthusiastic, and Silas telling him to be quiet with the resigned tone of someone who has made this particular request many times without permanent effect. Caleb looked at the barn door. Then he looked back at Eleanor. Something happened in his face that she had not seen before a full release of the careful control that was his ordinary presentation to the world, and what was underneath it was not what she had expected. It was warmer than she expected, younger than she expected. It was the face of a man who had been holding something carefully at a distance for a very long time and was now for the first time in years allowing himself to stop. She thought, there he is. He squeezed her hand once. Then he let go and went to the barn door and opened it and looked in at his brothers, who were arranged with the sound unconvincing casualness of people who have been caught listening and have not entirely decided how to handle this. You can come back inside, he said. Gideon came back inside with the energy of a man arriving at a party. The cottonwood tree at the western corner of the Triple H yard was old. Walt said it had been there when the first settlers came through the valley, that it had been old when they were new. It stood at the corner where the fence line turned north, and in the spring it came into leaf before anything else, because the corner was sheltered and caught the afternoon sun from 2 directions, and cottonwoods knew where the warmth was and moved toward it the way all living things move toward the warmth when winter has been long. By the 12th of April, its new leaves had fully opened, small and bright, and moving in the slightest wind, the particular green of spring that is more vivid than any other green because it has been earned by months of nothing. Gideon had ridden 40 miles to Tucson and brought back the Reverend Miles Whitfield, who was a man of 60 with a gray beard and the particular equanimity of a frontier preacher who had conducted services in locations ranging from properly consecrated buildings to the backs of wagons and standing water. He arrived the evening before and ate supper at the big table and told a story about his first winter in the territory that made Walt Calloway laugh out loud, which Eleanor had not previously understood was a sound Walt was capable of making. The morning of the 12th was cool and clear. They stood under the cottonwood tree. Clara Dawson had come at dawn, having received Gideon's message 4 days earlier, and having rearranged her week with the efficiency of a woman who believes in showing up for things that matter. She stood with Silas on one side and Gideon on the other. Walt stood beside Gideon with his hat in both hands and an expression of such composed dignity that it could only be concealing something real. Reverend Whitfield said the appropriate words and asked the appropriate questions, and then told him, as he apparently told everyone he married on the frontier, that the ceremony of it was nothing compared to the daily practice of it, and that the daily practice was everything. Then he said they could speak if they wanted to. Eleanor spoke first. "I came here in a storm," she said. "I did not come here looking for you. I came here because I was cold and I had run out of road. And you held out your hand in the snow without knowing anything about me, without knowing whether I was worth the trouble, because you saw a person who needed a hand, and that was sufficient reason." She looked at him in the spring morning light under the green of the cottonwood, with the sound of the ranch behind them and the blue Arizona sky above. "I spent 4 months watching you live," she said. "That is how I know. Not from what you told me. From how you are when no one is performing and nothing is arranged. From who you are at 5 in the morning checking the fence line, and who you are on the floor at midnight when the grief will not stay put. From how you said her name and kept her picture on the mantle, because to do otherwise would be a kind of lie, and you do not tell that kind of lie." She steadied herself. "I choose you," she said. "That is all. I choose you with the full knowledge of what it costs and what it means, and I choose you freely with somewhere else to go and enough to get there, which is the only kind of choosing that counts." He was still. The cottonwood moved above them in the light wind. Then Caleb Hartwell, who used words the way certain craftsmen use fine materials carefully, and only when they were the right thing for the purpose, spoke. "I was not looking for anyone," he said. "I had made my peace with that, or I thought I had. I had made my peace with the ranch and the work and the 2 people I had built my life with since we were young, and I had told myself that was a full life, and it was the honest truth." He looked at her. "And then there was a woman sitting in the snow in the wrong boots in a blizzard who looked up at me without flinching and told me the plain facts of her situation without asking for anything she had not earned the right to ask for." He paused. "I have been watching you since that moment. Every day, the way you learn things, the way you stand when something is hard, the way you sat with me in the dark and did not try to fill it with words." He took both her hands. "Rebecca was the first chapter of my life on this ranch, and I will not tell that story differently than it was. She was here, and then she was not, and that is a wound that does not close. It only learns to be part of the shape of things." He said this simply and without apology. "What I am telling you is that there is room, that I did not expect there to be, and then there was, and that does not happen by accident. It happens because of who you are." He said, "I choose you every morning going forward, as long as I have mornings to spend." Reverend Whitfield pronounced them married in the eyes of God and the territory of Arizona. Gideon made a sound. Silas put his hand on Gideon's arm. Walt looked at the horizon with the expression of a man thinking about something completely unrelated to the present moment, which was not true but was considerate. Clara Dawson looked at Eleanor with the look of a woman who has watched many things in her years in this territory, not all of them good, and is pleased when one of them is. The spring light came through the cottonwood leaves and laid its pattern on the ground around them, moving and shifting the way light does in a living tree, the way it does in a place that is alive. Time is a different thing on a working ranch in the American West. It does not move the way it moves in cities in straight lines from appointment to appointment, measured out in the increments of clocks and schedules. It moves the way seasons move in cycles, each one distinct and each one a variation on what came before. And the quality of a life is measured not in the linear accumulation of days, but in the depth of what each season gives and takes and leaves behind. The first spring of the Hartwell marriage gave them a garden that produced beyond what Eleanor had planned for because she had worked the soil well, and the spring was a good one, and Walt knew things about the specific tendencies of that corner of ground that he had not mentioned, and then did mention when the plants were already doing what he had known they would do. The first summer gave them the north pasture back. The land use claim had been voided, as Marshall Reeves had said it would be, and the creek ran through its proper channel into the upper pasture, and the cattle moved up to the summer grass, and the Triple H operated in its full capacity for the first time, without legal uncertainty hanging over the fence lines. The silver-bearing formation on the north parcel became through a process of patient negotiation and documented survey and the clear title work that Marshall Reeves's investigation had established a managed asset rather than a source of conflict. It did not make the Hartwells wealthy in the way that word is used for men who do not work with their hands. It made them secure. It gave the ranch a foundation that would outlast a run of bad seasons, which in ranch country was the only kind of security that actually meant anything. Warren Briggs left the county the following summer. He sold his properties to a buyer from back east who did not know the particular history of the Silver Palace and the land claims and the legal proceedings that had preceded the sale. This was not unusual. The territories were full of men selling their recent past to people who had not been there for it. His departure was noted without ceremony. Clara Dawson expanded her shop. She hired 2 women from newly arrived homesteading families and taught them what she knew about fabric and precision and the standards worth maintaining. The small school Eleanor had started in the community hall grew through the second year and the third, and by the 4th year it had a permanent building and a second teacher and 40 children on its rolls from a radius of 25 miles. The first of those children was Thomas Hartwell, born on a cold November morning. In the 3rd year, delivered by the doctor who had come to Red Rock with the expansion of the territorial population and set up his practice in the building where Mrs. Hobson's boarding house had previously operated. Caleb held his son for the first time with the care of a man who knows that some things require more steadiness than the work of hands has ever required, and the care and the steadiness were both completely evident to everyone in the room. He stood by the window afterward with the boy in his arms, looking out at the November landscape. The familiar ridge lines, the fence lines running out to their orderly distances, the barn and the cottonwood, all of it belonging to a life that had not ended in the way he once thought it had. Eleanor watched him from the bed. She saw him look at the window. She saw him look at the boy. She saw the moment when those 2 things, the landscape and the child, settled into a single fact about who he was and what he was made of. He looked back at her. She did not say anything. She did not need to. In the years that followed, Silas Hartwell married a school teacher from Tucson named Edith Wren, a woman of quiet precision who had read more books than anyone in the county and was not embarrassed about it, and had recognized in Silas Hartwell, on first acquaintance, a man who was the same way and was also not embarrassed about it. They built their own house on the east section of the Triple H property, and the 2 households shared the work of the ranch with the easy integration of people who have been doing complementary things for long enough that the seams no longer show. Gideon did not marry for many years despite what he described as considerable effort in that direction. He was present at every significant occasion of ranch life during those years, with the loyal and slightly chaotic energy that was his specific contribution to everything he participated in. He was the best horseman in the county by general agreement, and he trained horses for other ranches and knew every animal on the Triple H by name and personal history, and held strong opinions about all of them. Walt Calloway stayed. This was not remarkable to anyone who knew Walt. He had been there before the main house had a second room, and he would be there for as long as the ranch stood, and he would continue to notice things before anyone else noticed them, and say what needed to be said with the precision of a man who understood that silence and speech each had their proper uses. He taught Thomas Hartwell, when the boy was old enough, the same things he had taught Eleanor in the first winter. How to read the sky, how to read the ground, how the animals told you what the weather was going to do for the weather did it, how a working life on working land required a particular kind of attention, not the dramatic attention of crisis and confrontation, but the sustained daily attention of a person who understands that the world is always telling you something, and the quality of your listening is the measure of how well you can respond. Thomas learned. He was Caleb's son in the ways that counted patient and precise, and constitutionally unable to spend words he did not mean. He was also Eleanor's in the ways that also counted, which was that he read everything he could find and asked questions that were not always comfortable, and believed that showing the work was the standard by which things should be measured. 20 years passed. On an April evening, the 12th of the month, Caleb and Eleanor Hartwell sat on the porch of the main house that had grown through the years the way honest things grow, added to when there was reason, and never for show, solid and warm, and belonging completely to the place it stood. The cottonwood at the western corner was massive now. Its canopy covered most of the western yard and threw a shade in the late afternoons that it was its own kind of blessing in a country that ran hot in summer. Under it, earlier in the day, Thomas and his family had gathered for the occasion because the children of the Triple H had grown up understanding that April the 12th was the day the ranch celebrated. Gideon had cooked as he had cooked for every April 12 in 20 years, with the same elaborate investment of effort and the same willingness to discuss the process in detail during the eating of it that everyone accepted as part of what April the 12th meant. Now the yard was quiet. The children were inside. The evening was warm, the first truly warm evening of the season, and he had carried on it the smell of new growth and the particular promise of the high desert in spring, which is unlike any other spring in any other place. Caleb looked out from the porch at the yard and the fence lines and the ridge beyond it, the view he had looked at from this porch for 25 years. "Do you ever think about Boston?" he said. He asked her this occasionally, not often, once a year perhaps, in the evenings when the work was done and the house was quiet and there was room for the kind of conversation that does not need to solve anything. Eleanor looked at the cottonwood. She looked at the garden, larger than it had been in the first years, tended now by hands that knew it as well as hers. She looked at the main house, the additions that had come over 2 decades, the extended kitchen where so many meals had been made, the porch on which she was currently sitting, built by Caleb in the 5th year of their marriage on a Sunday in May, when Thomas was learning to walk and kept falling in the direction of whoever was nearest. She thought about what Boston had been, and what it had given her, and what she had left there, and what had been worth leaving, and what had not. "Sometimes," she said, "the way you think about a road you took a long time ago, not with regret, just with awareness that it was a road." He nodded. "And this one," he said. She looked at him. 20 years of mornings, 20 years of the same quiet presence that had been at the window in December of 1872. When she arrived cold and without resources or certainty, and that was at the window, now still facing the horizon, still in conversation with it. "This one," she said, "I chose." He put his hand over hers on the arm of the porch chair. The hand she had first seen, extended in the snow of a December blizzard, the hand of a man who offered what he had without condition or calculation. They sat on the porch of the house they had built together as the evening came down over the Arizona territory, gentle and warm and patient, the stars arriving one by one in the darkening sky above the ridge lines, above the cottonwood, above the fence lines, running out to their orderly distances across the ground that held everything they had made. Somewhere inside the house, a child laughed. The sound went out into the evening and up into the growing dark and joined all the other sounds that the Triple H Ranch had gathered over the years and kept, because that was what a home did. That was what it was for. The night settled, the stars came fully in, and on the porch in the dark, 2 people sat together in the particular silence that is not empty, the silence that is made of everything that has been said and done and endured and chosen, The silence that accumulates between people who have spent enough seasons alongside each other to know that some things do not need to be spoken because they are already known. They had come from different directions on a December night, and a winter had told them what they were, and the spring had given them the chance to say so, and every season since had been the proof of it. Not because circumstances demanded it, because they chose it. Every morning, for as many mornings as were given to them. That was the whole of the story. That was enough.